Alright, so I want to talk about how spiritual themes emerge in any worldly setting, particularly artistic settings, but in any secular setting, we're going to be able to discern spiritual outlook. Let's start with the thesis that everybody has a religion. So even if you claim, oh, I'm an atheist, I don't believe, or I believe in God, but I don't believe in organized religion, or I'm more spiritual than religious. Everybody is religious in their own way. So what I mean by that is everybody has rituals and ways of organizing their life based on how they find meaning and how they find purpose. And sometimes that has to do with a conscious acknowledgement and worship of God, and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm going to use an example of a very popular filmmaker, Paul Thomas Anderson. As far as I know, Paul Thomas Anderson is not religious, and I would assume, like most of Hollywood, he may have some vague belief in God, or he may have a direct belief in God, but is probably not involved in organized religious worship, and I would assume is probably sort of a rather typical example. He's a very popular filmmaker. I have a lot of admiration for his work. He's made 2 movies that do deal directly with the issue of religion. But I'm going to show how those 2 movies actually only fit into a much broader framework of spiritual outlook that Mr. Anderson himself might not even be aware of. So let's start with Anderson's first big hit, Boogie Nights. 1997, Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights is a film that's set in the 1970s in America about the pornography industry, starring a young protagonist by the name of Dirk Diggler, who becomes a big adult film, quote-unquote adult film, movie star, a porn star. Now, aside from being about the pornography industry, the movie actually attempts and very successfully captures a sort of slice of life of America. So it's about a period of time right before the advent of home movies, VCRs, video recorders. It's only 20 years removed, of course, from the 1950s, when most American homes only had one television set that got only a few channels. Technology is moving very rapidly, but basically Boogie Nights captures this sort of era and also deals thematically in the film with this idea of the entertainment industry, rapidly changing and consumers sort of having more choice. And so because of all those factors, basically Boogie Nights, in a sort of dark, perverse way, it represents a kind of Edenic state, right? Eden, of course, a garden of earthly delights. And of course we'll remember that in the Garden of Eden, one of the distinguishing things about Eden is that Adam and Eve are naked, and they have no shame in their nudity, and they're free to basically do whatever they want. We can leave that to our imaginations. And the fall out of Eden only comes after they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So obviously there's a lot that could be analyzed regarding that, but suffice it to say, for the purpose of this analysis, that Boogie Nights really sort of represents, like I said, maybe a darkly humorous and slightly perverse sort of Edenic state for America and for the entertainment industry, which might be America's most powerful cultural export at this point. Well, I would even say inarguably is America's most powerful cultural symbol, movies, television show. And one last thing I would mention about this particular movie before we move on is that there's really sort of a symbolism within a symbolism, or maybe just a meta quality to this, because the movie is made in 1997. So in fact, Paul Thomas Anderson had either the foresight or the good fortune to make this movie before the pornography industry would be changed. Well, excuse me, the entire entertainment industry, but within the context of the film, would be changed again by the advent of the internet. So Mr. Anderson makes a movie on the cusp of the internet radically transforming entertainment in America, about another era in which technology radically transforms entertainment. So let's talk about another blockbuster movie made by Paul Thomas Anderson. Now, this is not every movie he's made in order. I'm dealing with 4 films specifically. So, There Will Be Blood. Now, There Will Be Blood is similar to Boogie Nights, only in one very narrow sense. It is a masterpiece of cinema that captures a snapshot in time of, a crucial turning point in American history. So, in There Will Be Blood, we have a movie about, I guess you could say, an oil baron or a captain of industry, a very worldly man. He's totally secular, atheist, non-religious. He actually, as it turns out, as the movie goes on, is hostile to religion, although in the beginning we don't really get that sense. And, well, let's say there are actually 2 protagonists. So the crux of the story, really, no pun intended, is the conflict between these 2 main characters, Daniel Plainview and Eli Sunday. So in this turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, that is, late 19th century, early 20th century context, Daniel Plainview represents the secular forces of capitalism, market, industry, atheism, and he's juxtaposed against this character Eli Sunday, who's a small town preacher in this little town that exists on these oil fields that Plainview wants to drill on. So Eli Sunday sort of represents this pre-industrial, rural, you could say Euro-American Protestant force of religion, right? He's got a little church, a little congregation. Before Daniel Plainview comes in, we can assume Eli Sunday is sort of the main spiritual force in this town called Little Boston, where most of the movie is set. So, as the movie progresses, it becomes very clear, right, that Daniel Plainview, although he is an atheist and hostile to religion even, actually sort of represents a spiritual force of nature much greater than Eli Sunday. Eli Sunday professes God with his mouth, and he prays, and he has a church and a congregation, and is presumably familiar with Scripture, but he's revealed to be very shallow in his faith and, superficial and hypocritical. Basically, he sees an opportunity as Daniel Plainview develops, this industrial base in the town of Little Boston. Eli Sunday sort of sees a chance to ride on Plainview's coattails and cooperate with him and try to grow his spiritual enterprise, his church, on the coattails of Daniel Plainview's purely materialistic energy enterprise, his oil enterprise. Daniel Plainview sees this immediately, and it basically becomes sort of cat and mouse game where Plainview slowly becomes more and more hostile to Eli Sunday and his hypocrisy and his superficial spirituality, and in the end literally destroys him. So this can be seen, of course, as a pretty obvious metaphor for market forces triumphing over spirituality and religion, you know, and by beginning the movie in 1898, and I think it ends somewhere in the 1920s or 30s, you know, we see how this seed was there right from the beginning, right? This is not something that has emerged in our lifetimes. It's something that was built into the Industrial Revolution and was facilitated by the weakness of organized religion and, you know, religious belief and worship even before that. So, also, Daniel Plainview is this very sort of Nietzschean figure. He does represent a spiritual force of nature, but in a very Old Testament sense. He's not entirely wicked. A lot of critics and a lot of viewers came away with that impression. I disagree. You know, we do see human sides to Plainview. He longs for a family relationship. He adopts a son, and even though he exploits this adopted son, he does demonstrate that he actually cares about him. And when a guy shows up claiming to be Plainview's brother, Plainview instantly takes him in and supports him, and he's desperate for family connection. So Plainview is not a cardboard cutout of a villain, contrary to what a lot of critics claim. What he really is like I said, a sort of Nietzschean figure who is beyond the morality of the average person. He sees a lot in the world that he doesn't like, and he's very determined and focused to shape the world in his image, which of course we know, watching from the 20th century, men like Daniel Plainview very much did, right? So he is an Old Testament figure, much like the modern reader can read the Old Testament and be very confused by, you know, the way God is represented in the Old Testament, how God seems to do things that are sometimes arbitrary, capricious, or even cruel. Daniel Plainview represents a sort of Old Testament force reality. This is the spiritual force of nature that created the modern world, right? And I'm reminded of the passage in the 45th chapter of Isaiah, verse 7. I create light and dark. I create good and evil. I create all these things, says the Lord God, right? So that is how Plainview sees himself, and, you know, even to the point of, you know, murdering a preacher and actively becoming hostile to religion throughout the course of the movie. The very next movie that Paul Thomas Anderson makes is The Master. So in The Master we have, again, a masterpiece of a snapshot in time of a certain era in America. And this happens to be the pinnacle of sort of American sophistication, at least in a lot of people's minds in a historical context, right? It's immediately after World War II. There's a sense of triumph, a sense of ascension. You know, the American empire is beginning to really take shape and, you know, seem like this actual plausible, tangible thing. But the movie actually focuses on just one veteran of World War II, a Navy veteran who saw active duty during World War II. He gets out of the Navy and he's lost and he's adrift. And at first he's presented as a very miserable, misanthropic, crude, sleazy, very unlikable character, right? And this is Freddie Quell. Freddie Quell seems to share exactly one characteristic with Daniel Plainview. They're both worldly men, not devout or religious in any way, and both pretty unlikable, right? And I would even stop to point out real quick that Daniel Plainview, when he's moving into Little Boston, when he's insinuating himself in and, you know, beginning his exploitation of the town, he does it under the pretense of hunting quail, right? And so we have Fred E. Quell, right? And I think there might also be a play on words of the term equal. I'm not really sure, but Freddie Quell and Daniel Plainview are both these sort of misanthropic, worldly, you know, unlikable characters. Eventually, Freddie Quell runs into a person by the name of Lancaster Dodd. Now, Lancaster Dodd shares exactly one characteristic with Eli Sunday. He aspires to be a religious leader. A lot of critics claim, and I don't know at all the accuracy or not of this, that Dodd is supposed to be based on L. Ron Hubbard. I would say, from what little I do know about Scientology, that that's fair enough from what I know. Lancaster Dodd leads this sort of New Age, you know, non-biblical, quasi-New, you know, it seems like very Scientology-ish sort of movement, but it's totally peripheral to the plot. It has nothing to do with my personal analysis of the movie. But Lancaster Dodd shares this with Eli Sunday. He aspires to be a religious leader, and he does have followers. He has people who follow him and hang on his every word and believe in his writings, and you know, they host him in his home. Unlike the small, you know, the small town rural folk of turn of the century Little Boston, Lancaster Dodd's audience are these affluent, refined, sophisticated Americans. Like I said, we see them, you know, sort of basking in this post-World War II prosperity. They have nice homes and nice clothes, and they're having dinner parties, but they still are following a charlatan, just like the uneducated peasants, quote-unquote, of Little Boston. Lancaster Dodd is very gregarious and very charming and very outgoing. He's played by the inimitable Philip Seymour Hoffman. And so Freddie Quell stows away on Dodd's ship, and they meet, and they sort of form this relationship. And at first it seems like Freddie is just kind of latching onto him because Freddie is so spiritually bereft, you know, that he's looking for something to do with his life. He's fleeing from this little incident, you know, that happened. It's not really fleshed out, but he gets kind of accused of poisoning this migrant worker, but the movie never, you know, makes it explicit that he's like actually wanted by the authorities. It shows him being chased across a field by some migrant workers, but there's not any indication that he actually fears for, you know, being pursued by the authorities. In fact, the movie would seem to indicate otherwise because he interacts with law enforcement and he's never charged with anything like that. So this was another mistake that a lot of reviewers and critics made. Freddie winds up with Lancaster Dodd, and as the movie progresses, this is a brilliant plot development. And I want to say that I think the master was criminally, no pun intended, criminally underrated by critics and reviewers. The master is a masterpiece. As the movie progresses, it becomes clear, like with Daniel Plainview and Eli Sunday, that Freddie Quell actually has a sort of spiritual nature about him that is much stronger and much more authentic than Lancaster Dodd. And in fact, we start to see that that is why Lancaster Dodd puts up with him. And in the end, this is actually a movie about friendship. It is darkly humorous, and it's fairly dry and boring compared to a lot of movies, even Paul Thomas Anderson's other movies. But it's a movie about this unlikely friendship. And Freddie, that develops between these two men, who are complete opposites in almost every respect. And in fact, Freddie Quell begins to emerge as this sort of dark and perverse Christ figure. He has a dark charisma that winds up affecting not just Lancaster Dodd, but even Lancaster Dodd's followers. At first they're jealous of Freddie, and they don't understand why Dodd puts up with him. He's very unlikable and boorish and rude. But, you know, eventually they see that, you know, it's not, there's just a sort of, you know, an authenticity, I guess. There's an authenticity about Freddie that is lacking in this world of pretension and, you know, immediate post-World War II refinement. Freddie is really searching. A lot of these people are just sort of pretending to search for answers or aspire to spiritual things. Freddie is really lost and looking. And I would note that one of the first things that happens when Freddie and Lancaster meet, oh, by the way, Freddie is sort of an amateur bootlegger. And this is one of the quirky little things about the film. It's Freddie makes these sort of concoctions from like common industrial ingredients. It's kind of far-fetched but yet realistic. They're supposed to be these like alcoholic beverages, but anywhere he goes, he basically just takes, you know, like cleaning products or film developing solution. He takes, you know, explosive fluid from a torpedo on his ship, and he makes these drinks that people drink and they get intoxicated from. So when he first meets Lancaster Dodd, he gives Dodd some of this, and Dodd loves it and has him make some for a wedding party that's taking place on Dodd's ship. Of course, this is completely analogous, well, you know, darkly, perversely analogous to the wedding party at Cana in the 2nd chapter of John's Gospel, right? And Freddy is a sailor, of course, that the image of fishermen and, you know, maritime nautical men, you know, being reminiscent of the New Testament, the Gospel. That's a prominent theme, of course. And, you know, despite it all, it takes a sort of careful viewing of the movie, but, you know, Freddy is unlikable. You know, he crudely hits on women, and he's kind of rude to men. But other than that, he really doesn't have any serious flaws. He's not really trying to harm anyone or get over on anyone or scam anyone. You know, he's unlikable on a very superficial level, but really he's, for the most part, not only harmless, but actually vulnerable. So in my opinion, you know, Freddy sort of serves as this very, you know, faintly and perversely sort of Christ-like figure. And like I said, in the end, the movie is actually about friendship. And, you know, this idea that this unlikely friendship develops between these two men. And there's even a line in the very last scene where Lancaster Dodd, it's a very poignant line in my opinion, where he says, "If we meet in another life, we will be mortal enemies, and I will show you no mercy." And then he sings this song to Freddy, this ridiculous old jazz standard called "Slow Boat to China," and Freddy starts to well up with tears. It, to me, is a very moving scene, because that is, you know, the movie in the end is just about this, how this friendship develops between these two completely different men, how it could only have happened at that one particular time and place. So there's actually a lot to this movie that recalls to me the Gospels, because this is how I see the story of Christ, something that could have only happened in one particular time and place, in Judea, under Roman occupation. And of course, Christ teaches us that love has no greater than that a man should lay down his life for his friends. The final scene in the movie, Freddy is just sitting in a movie theater doing nothing, you know, kind of hanging out, the same guy that he was at the beginning of the movie, and he gets a phone call from Lancaster Dodd, and he hops on a plane and goes to see him in England, which will lead us to our next movie here shortly. The point is, Freddy drops everything and goes to see his friend Lancaster Dodd. Lancaster Dodd has been in trouble with the law. A lot of people now see, you know, openly think and claim that Dodd is a fraud. Excuse my rhyming. You know, but Freddy doesn't care. All he was really looking for was a friend. That was the spiritual, you know, and Lancaster Dodd sort of thought that he was taking Freddy in, but in the end, really, Freddy sort of pulls Dodd into, you know, this, there's an overlapping spear or whatever. So, excuse me, sphere. So for me, the Master sort of represents more of a meditation on these themes reminiscent of the New Testament. And, you know, it's a master, excuse my pun, no pun intended, you know, a brilliant inversion of, you know, these characters. Freddy starts out as the worldly sort of Daniel Plainview-ish figure, and then you have these two spiritual figures, but in the end, Freddy's love in his own way and his authenticity wins over Dodd, rather than, you know, Daniel Plainview beating to death this religious charlatan and hypocrite. Freddy Quell sort of gives spiritual nourishment even to a sinful, fraudulent hypocrite. Finally, we have Phantom Thread. Now, Phantom Thread is the only one of these movies that is not set in America. Phantom Thread did not, you know, it was not a big commercial hit. The Master was not, and the Phantom Thread were not. These are seemingly uneventful movies. And particularly Phantom Thread you know, I will admit there's not a lot of action in Phantom Thread. Phantom Thread is about a dressmaker who lives in London. And he meets a woman, and they develop a relationship. It gets a little bit, you know, there's a little bit of tension, no more than any normal relationship. And then the movie ends. So, for obvious reasons, this did not put a lot of keisters in the seats in the theaters. The protagonist, the dressmaker, is Reynolds Woodcock. Now, in Boogie Nights and Phantom Thread, there are no overt spiritual or religious themes whatsoever. Obviously, Boogie Nights needs no explanation as far as that goes. But in Phantom Thread, aside from the fact that Reynolds at one point mentions making a dress for some member of royalty's first communion, there are no overt spiritual or religious elements to the story. But we know, those of us who are familiar with the New Testament, that the theme of putting on new clothes is a common theme of the New Testament. Putting on new garments. And even in the Old Testament, we see sort of, where there are references, of course, before you were knit in the womb. And another thing that Reynolds Woodcock does is he has this quirk of sewing a name into the people's dresses, into the dresses that he sews. So not like that they can be seen, he sort of sews them into the fabric. And of course we'll remember that Adam, the pre-fall Adam, before he fell and ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, one of the distinguishing features of him as the first man was the privilege given to him by God of naming all the animals. And there are other, you know, subtle references to sort of, you know, biblical themes. This Reynolds gets sick, you know, he develops this relationship with this woman, and there's this sort of bizarre, you know, a ritual they begin where, like, she poisons him mildly to where he falls ill. But in this weird twist, he actually sort of seems to kind of like it. And of course, the fact that she's poisoning him also recalls, you know, the Eve giving Adam the apple in the Garden of Eden. But rather than destroying him and losing, you know, killing him, which for a moment it seems like that is going to be the crux of the plot, he recovers and he knows that she's poisoned him, and he actually almost seems, you know, he basically infers to her without saying it explicitly that he wants her to do it again. So they go on to have this, you know, the relationship continues, and they eventually marry, even in the movie. And Reynolds has this, you know, sort of this fondness for his mother. At one point, his mother appears to him in this sort of vision, you know, this sort of angelic vision of his mother. And there are very subtle, you know, very subtle references like that to sort of biblical stories and themes. Other than that, the movie is really just sort of a slice of Anglo-American worldly paradise, which is important. I mean, it's set in London, but there's nothing distinctive about it. Because the film revolves around only a few characters, and he lives in this palatial estate, I mean, it could be Massachusetts or up, you know, New York or whatever. It's, you know, just very upper class, sophisticated people. He makes dresses for royalty. He lives in this world of sophistication and refinement, and that, you know, because of the masterful cinematography that Paul Thomas Anderson regularly produces, you know, it's a great movie to watch. It's, you know, the kind of movie that makes you want to put on a very nice suit and drink tea and crumpets and drive around in a big old, you know, Rolls-Royce sedan on a windy road along the cliffside, along the seaside, the seashore and the cliffs or whatever, right? And that is really the main effect that the movie has. So, well, it was for me, anyways. So by now you're probably seeing where I'm going with this. If we take these four movies, we can see a clear progression. And Phantom Thread is made in 2017. I believe Master is 2012. So 20 years exactly. Now, I have read that Boogie Nights actually began as a short film. It was the first, a sort of prototype of it was made as a short film by Paul Thomas Anderson when he was 18 years old. So I'm pretty firmly convinced that Paul Thomas Anderson did not have this progression or this trajectory in mind when he started with Boogie Nights. And this goes back to my thesis. I have no idea what Paul Thomas Anderson's religious beliefs or practices were or are. But the fact is, he is a brilliant artist. And I would assume, if I had to, he's probably fairly open-minded, you know, maybe, about spiritual things. Regardless of whether he is or is not, he has created a body of work that deals masterfully with the issues of spirituality and organized religion and how they relate to our modern world. We go from this, you know, Edenic pre-fall world in America in the 1970s to this sort of New Testament, you know, new world being created, or excuse me, Old Testament, you know, a world being created in a sort of Old Testament morality, you know, epic, and There Will Be Blood, to this sort of New Testament meditation on friendship in this, you know, in this burgeoning empire, in the world of a burgeoning American empire, to this, you know, redeemed state. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, and I don't mean to be crude here at all, but, you know, we have the young pornography star, Dirk Diggler, and then the recreated Adam, the polar opposite of Dirk Diggler, who is this very refined London dressmaker by the name of Reynolds Woodcock, in this sort of redeemed, you know, recreated Eden, which of course a lot of believers understand to be the ultimate goal to which we're striving for as followers of Christ, is to live in glory with God, the ultimate dressmaker who takes off the old man and puts on the new. And of course, simply the fact that Reynolds does this for a living. He puts clothes on women. You know, there are many oppositions or appositions or juxtapositions between this character and this character, these two characters. And, you know, it's so brilliant. You know, of course, one of the main ways that any artist conveys ideas or explores ideas in a artistic way, in a sublime way, is through the use of juxtaposition, compare and contrast, opposition, apposition. You know, it's common in literature and photography and art. You know, just seeing the same thing from two different angles, or presenting the same thing in two different perspectives, you know, or illustrating archetypes through their opposites. And, you know, Paul Thomas Anderson has done this over the course of 20 years. And, you know, there's opposition against opposition within opposition. You know, it's brilliant stuff. And finally, I would add one last note, because some of you might be asking, well, okay, but these aren't the only movies that were made during these 20 years. Like I said, it might not be intentional that Paul Thomas Anderson did this. It might just be, you know, Paul Thomas Anderson himself might be a spiritual force of nature such that his creative genius produced this body of work that reflects these universal truths. These aren't the only movies, you might say, that were made during these 20 years. No. And I'm not going to talk about the other movies, but I will note there are 3 movies, Magnolia, Punch Drunk Love, and Inherent Vice, that were made during this period of time. You could say a trinity of movies. So in our analysis here, we have a trinity of movies that exist within this matrix and also outside the matrix. And I don't think I need to hit anybody over the head with the significance of that. So we have a brilliant body of work exploring themes on a biblically epic scale in modern cinematic terms, interwoven with this trinity of other movies. And that's my analysis of Paul Thomas Anderson. Thank you for watching.